stories don't define you. How you tell them will. Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Story Maker of Elkins Consulting. We share stories for many reasons, to persuade, to entertain, and to connect. What we sometimes forget is the impact of the stories we tell ourselves. Whether you're sharing personal stories or business stories, how you share them makes a difference in how you remember them and in how you're perceived by the people you're interacting with. In this series, you'll hear stories that will resonate with you and you'll nod your head in understanding. And then we'll dig into lessons from each of those situations. When I'm working with clients, I remind them to listen for understanding, not to respond. But during this podcast, I'm actually asking you to listen and think about your related stories, to listen and consider which stories in your life might have impacted you in a similar way. You can visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn how I can help you and your team uncover relevant, personal stories to improve sales and communication. Our first son was slow with words, but fast with walking and climbing. He was pulling himself upstairs before he could even crawl. And he was climbing walls as soon as he could walk. I mean, literally climbing walls. He would use the baseboard to begin his ascent. When he was about a year old, I noticed that when I handed him something or helped him with something, he would say, dee-dah, in a sing-song voice. Dee-dah. It was different from his da, which meant he wanted something. That word sounded like that. He didn't have words or sentences, but if you have experience with little children, you know sometimes you can understand certain phrases before they sound like words. I was chatting with my mother one day over the phone, and she heard him say, dee-dah, when I handed him something. What's he saying? I told her I didn't know. She said, it sounds like he's saying thank you. Maybe, Mom, that might be what he's saying. Throughout the day, I decided to test her theory. I paid more attention as I handed him food or something else he asked for. And he was absolutely using that phrase in the correct context. I called my mother later that day to tell her she was right. I said, I didn't know he knew that. I haven't been working with him on that one. We definitely work on please, but thank you really hasn't been something we've been talking about. My mom reminded me that he was saying that because he was hearing me say that to people. He was hearing his father say that to me. What a great thing to hear from someone you respect and admire, right? It felt pretty good. I was feeling a little smug in terms of my parenting. Knowing my son was picking up what I thought was a really good habit, those pleases and thank yous, felt pretty good. At that point, I became a bit more aware and intentional about what I was saying around him. But not entirely aware, which is why I was caught off guard about a year later at a grocery store. I was visiting family in the Baltimore area, and my cousin and I took Jacob along to pick up some groceries. They had that new grocery cart with the truck front and the basket back. That way kids could pretend they were driving. And when we walked in and Jacob saw it, his eyes lit up. He pointed to ask if we could take that cart. He loved anything trucks, tractors, construction vehicles. So of course I said, yes, go ahead. So he got in the little cart and he sat down at the wheel, pretending he was driving. And literally seconds after I started to push the cart toward the produce section, he pretended to honk his horn and yelled, come on, buddy. I blushed, glanced over at my cousin, laughing, and she said, well, Sarah, it could have been a lot worse, right? That was when I realized how much of what we were saying and doing made impressions on our children. If you have children, I'm sure you have those embarrassing stories of them sharing things they overheard that you are mortified to hear come out of their mouths. Years ago, I had a boss who was a skilled manipulator. She's very smart, very ambitious, but not confident or comfortable in her skin. She treated me with incredible cruelty. She figured out my most sensitive anxieties and poked them regularly. It was a horrible 2.5 years, but not just because of the abuse. I found that I made it worse. I was behaving like she behaved, and I started to seriously dislike myself. She was modeling abusive behavior, and I was picking it up just like my children picked up my cues. It hadn't occurred to me before that experience that even as adults, We're constantly observing the people around us and picking up their subtle behavioral cues. Some with intention, others not so much. When visiting a friend's house last summer, I thanked her for hosting our small group of friends and let her know how lovely the snacks looked on her serving plates. That's something I picked up from you and Bob. Every time I come to your house, even unannounced, you have something nice to put out, and you always offer me a drink right after I walk in the door. I love that, and realized I want people to feel at my house the way I feel when I'm at yours. Aha. My brain started to focus on what her compliment meant to me, beyond the honor of being emulated for something that I find great satisfaction in, hosting people. But it took me a few minutes to process what I heard and apply it to my bigger theory. As I've said many times in relation to customer service and personal brand, we are ambassadors for our people. How we behave around others is watched, and though it's not fair, our behavior is often associated with different aspects of our visible presence. At any given moment, I'm representing women, mothers, people from Montana, Jews, whatever else my appearance and speech may give away. What I present to the world can have a positive or negative impact on others like me. There aren't many Jewish people here in Montana, and I've heard more than once, "You don't look Jewish," and "I met a Jewish guy once, he was such an asshole." And my favorite, because it's so absurd, "I love Jewish people." Those interactions and how I handled them could be the difference between this person passing along their bias and bigotry or not. Another thing I've noticed that relates to this idea of being an ambassador is that we are all role models for the people around us, and not just our children. People watch how we behave, and when they see something they like, they may internalize the behavior and emulate it. Sometimes it's subconscious, like the way our facial expressions often mirror those of the person in front of us. And sometimes, like my friend who loved being hosted at my house, emulating that at her house, that's very intentional. When I observe a particularly impressive handling of conflict by someone, I'll process it for a while and figure out if I can emulate that response. And when I had young children, I watched other mothers to see what worked and what definitely did not work. What we do, how we behave, matters. If we want to see things change in the world, and I believe from the many rants and stories I read every day online that we do, we have to start with us. As a public employee, I receive many calls like this. "My neighbor wakes me up at 6 a.m. on Saturday by mowing his lawn. Isn't there a noise ordinance?" Yes, there's a noise ordinance. But rather than call the police to come measure it and maybe ticket your neighbor, have you considered approaching him and asking why he's mowing at 6 a.m.? Maybe he has a good reason. Maybe you can find a solution together. I find that when I approach my neighbors with respect, and rather than complain, ask questions first, that way I share the responsibility to find a solution. And when I do that, they generally respond really well. People are afraid of conflict. They don't want to approach a neighbor or stranger, so they escalate the issue by calling the city or the police. Or they complain online, spewing negative energy and making things so much worse. And what they don't realize is they're modeling that behavior to an even larger audience. Most of these situations could easily be resolved if we approach them with consideration and an open mind. Model the behavior we want to see, and people will notice the success we have in certain situations. And maybe, just maybe, this can be the beginning of a trend where instead of adding to the negative energy, we can be proactive in finding solutions. It's not about being a Pollyanna. It's not about seeing only the positive or being a Facebook fake by sharing only the good stuff. It's about choosing the behavior you want to see in the world around you and demonstrating it. If you want to be around people who are respectful and kind, smart and ambitious, model those behaviors, especially around people who do not demonstrate those things. Because when you lower yourself to that level and you behave the way they behave, you're condoning that behavior. If you want people around you to introduce themselves when they walk in the door with a firm handshake and clearly enunciating their name, model that. If you want people to hold the door open for you when your hands are full, let you into traffic when the lane ends, or give you space when walking across the street, do those things. If you want to hear please and thank you from people, say please and thank you. And if you want to change the negative tendencies online, don't post or share that energy. There are always people who will try to bait you into that negative space, but don't let them. What do you want to see in the world around you? Are you modeling that? Thank you for listening to Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Share Them Will. Please visit my website for more podcast episodes, blog posts, and information about how I can help you develop and share your stories at elkinsconsulting.com.
Listen to me, honey, while I say, how could you tell me that you're going away?